Okay, guys, so we'll be talking about inflation today, won't we? So, what is inflation? So, what do you mean to inflate something? When you inflate a balloon, let's say, what do you do? When you inflate a balloon, you increase the size of the balloon. So, what is meant by inflation? Inflation is nothing but increasing the size of money, not the power, the size of money. So, let's assume you can see here the definition of inflation as defined by an academy. Inflation can be defined as a rise in the general level of prices of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. So, inflation, this is the basic definition of inflation. So, now there are two types of inflations: CPI or Consumer Price Index inflation, and WPI or Wholesale Price Index inflation. So, just to give you an overview of both of them, this is the inflation regarding all the unmanufactured goods, like the fruits you eat, suppose, or the vegetables you buy from the supermarket. These are the unmanufactured goods. And WPI inflation, it deals with all the manufactured goods as a whole basket. So I'll talk about these two in my later videos, in my next video actually. So let's keep these two aside for the moment. Okay, now you must be thinking, why does inflation arise anyway? Why is there a general increase in the level of prices across the country or across the area or across the world? So let me explain it to you. So increase in prices, right? So okay, so let's assume let's bring an image of an onion market. Let's say our onion vendor here has 100 onions, and each priced at around rupees 5 per onion, and he's got 25 customers every year coming to him to buy all those 100 onions. So what happens this year is that there is an increase in demand. There is an increase in demand for his onions. More number of people want to buy his 100 onions. So from 25, the number goes on to, let's say, 50. So the number of people wanting to buy the onions has doubled. Let's not take supply into question. So if keeping the number of onions constant, if keeping the number of onions 100, he says that okay, so if more people want to buy it, if there's an increased demand, why don't I increase my profits by raising the price from over 5 rupees to, let's say, 10 rupees, by doubling the price as my number of customers has doubled. This is 1, it's 10 actually. Okay, so he thinks that is what demand is. So when there is an increase in demand, there is an increase in price. So why is there an inflation in the country? So when there is an increase in number of when there is an increase in the jobs in the country, or there is an increase in the level of money in the country, when the government starts putting into more and more money into the system so as to boost the economy, there's a general prosperity in the country. The companies are reporting better earnings, there's an increased employment, there's an increased need for expenditure. So families and people are spending more and more money, pouring more and more money into let's say consumer brands, then going to the movies, going to restaurants, then employment, more number of people getting employed, etc, etc. So this creates a general increase in the prices, as there is a general increased demand in the prices. So there is inflation. So is inflation good for the economy? People say that inflation is terrible and we don't want prices to increase, blah blah blah. But they don't take into account this. When there is no inflation, there is no growth. Some inflation is necessary for keeping the economy running, as according to most economists, and it is the truth. So if there is no inflation, imagine from 1970 levels, if there was no inflation throughout this period, your salary back then, which would have been over, say, 1,000 rupees, not even 1,000 rupees, 700 800 rupees, it would have remained the same right now. Wouldn't you think that's not great? Because when there is no inflation, there is also no inflation in your salaries. So that is also a very big boost to inflation, which creates a very good stimulus to the economy. Okay, still didn't quite understand inflation? Okay, let's make it easier to you. So we have got our farmer Raju here, who belongs to a small village in rural India. So what Raju does is he gets 200 rupees home every year, which is a bit too understated actually. He gets 200 rupees every year home. And what he does is he divides this into two branches. The first branch 100 rupees, the second one 100 rupees. For the first branch, he buys some bread for himself, which is his food for the year. And okay, assume this to be bread. Yeah, so he buys bread for 100 rupees, a bread loaf, let's say, and for the next 100 rupees, he saves them into his, let's say, his locker. He just keeps them into his locker for the future. So okay, that is pretty good. He's getting a stable salary and he's able to sustain himself. So what happens when he passes through the local banker's office? He overhears the banker saying to his accountant that the inflation is raging at 10%. And Raju says, "Oh, okay, it must be one of those fancy economic terms, and it mustn't matter to me, would it?" So he says, "Okay, it doesn't really matter." So the next year again, Raju gets his salary back, the same 200 rupees, and he goes to the bread loaf, the baker, sorry, and he asks the baker to give him the same bread loaf for his 100 rupees. But now what happens? The same bread loaf now costs him 110 rupees because inflation was raging at 10%. Okay, which means he has to dip into 10 rupees of his savings. So 10 rupees is a huge big thing for a person who is getting a salary of 200 rupees. That is 5% of his total annual income, isn't it? So that is what inflation is. It destroys your power, it destroys your wealth. So how can you beat inflation? Well, that is necessary, isn't it? Because let's say, because last year's 100 rupees is now 100 and now last year's bread costing 100 rupees is now costing 110 rupees. So he has to pay 10 rupees extra for the same amount of bread. So how does he defeat this? How does he kill inflation? Okay, now I told you that Raju saves 100 rupees for his future. So how can he beat inflation? So now if you look at the current deposit, the fixed deposits which you use in bank, if Raju invests in one of them, then he'll get an annual return of 6% per annum. So which means his 100 rupees will translate into 106 rupees tomorrow. Okay, so if he invested these 100 rupees and the next year he goes with these 106 rupees to buy the same bread loaf, then he won't be able to do it, really, because now he's got 106 rupees, 6% compounded. But inflation makes the bread cost 110 rupees, so that's a -4 loss for him. Still, it is not he's not able to muster up enough money to beat inflation. Now what to do? So if you look at the census from Sensex, which is the standard index for stock market in India, if you look at the annual returns given by Sensex, the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate given by Sensex since 1986 till 2019, it is 13.59%, which means 1 lakh invested in 1986 would translate into outstanding 71 lakh today in 2019. So okay, even if he invests in equities and gets a return of 12%, the whole sum into equities, he gets a return of 12%, and the 100 rupees change into 112 rupees. Okay, so he has beaten inflation and he has managed to gain 2 rupees in extra. So that is the power of equities. Equities help you to beat inflation and not debt. But necessarily you can't make up your whole portfolio with equities, because equities are subject to market risk, and debt securities are not so risky instruments. I want to really talk about asset allocation in my next videos, and I'll also talk about hyperinflation and deflation. By the time being, I hope you like the video, and don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. I'd like to talk about equities and asset allocation because these things are extremely important as a financial measure in every person's life in this world. So thank you for the time being. Thank you.